Further petitions.
Petitions, orders of the day.
Ballot item number 10, Order M32, second reading of Bill 32, an act to repeal the Niagara Escarpment Planning and Development Act and to make a related amendment to the Ministry of Natural Resources Act. Mr. MacLaren.
The member for Carleton, Mississippi Mills.
Mr. Speaker, I move second reading of Bill number 32, an act to repeal the Niagara Escarpment Planning and Development Act and to make a related amendment to the Ministry of Natural Resources Act.
Mr. MacLaren has moved second reading of Bill 92, an act to repeal the Niagara Escarpment Planning and Development Act and to make a related amendment to the Ministry of Natural Resources Act. Pursuant to Standing Order 98, the member has 12 minutes for his presentation. The member for Carleton, Mississippi Mills.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to tell you the story of Bob Mackey. I met Bob in 2007. This was the year that the Niagara Landowners Association had their founding meeting. This was the year that the dark body called the Niagara Escarpment Commission intruded into Bob's life. This was the year that Bob's use and enjoyment of his private property began to end. This was the year that Bob's 7-year battle in court began. 2014 was the year that Bob Mackey died. His heart couldn't take it any longer. The stress killed him. So what terrible thing did Bob Mackey do that would make government think that it was in the public interest to persecute him in court for 7 years? What heinous crime did he commit? Bob's awful offense against the people, against the Crown, against the government that required the full force infliction of the law in order that justice should be seen to be done was that he dared to operate a small archery training facility on his 9-acre rural property where he lived near the town of Beamsville. It doesn't get much worse than that. Thank God for the law. Bob loved archery, and he was very good at it. So he set up a shooting range with targets and fake deer and bears and raccoons in his 9-acre backyard. He also had 2 mobile trailers in his backyard for indoor target practice in the winter months or on rainy days. Bob gave archery lessons to school children, Boy Scouts, members of the Brain Injury Community Reentry Program, adults, in other words, anyone who enjoyed archery. Bob's archery training facility was the only one in the local community, and he had the full support of the people in his community and of the municipality. Unfortunately, his next-door neighbor decided to lodge a complaint against Bob with the Niagara Escarpment Commission because of noise and traffic. Archery does not make noise, and there were never more than 5 or 6 cars at Bob's place at any one time. The Niagara Escarpment Commission decided that Bob had committed a crime. The Niagara Escarpment Plan showed that Bob's 9-acre property was agricultural, and nowhere in the Niagara Escarpment Plan did it say that archery was a permitted use in an agricultural operation. It did not say that archery was not permitted. It just didn't mention archery at all. The NEC ruled that archery was not permitted on Bob's land, and therefore he must stop his archery lessons and remove his 2 mobile trailers. Martin Killian, the planning staff at the Niagara Escarpment Commission, was instrumental in making this decision. The order was written that Bob Mackey must end his archery business. Bob decided not to comply with the order. He knew he was doing nothing wrong. He knew that he had loyal customers who appreciated his archery training, and he enjoyed teaching archery to his customers. Bob hired lawyers and spent 7 years in court fighting the Niagara Escarpment Commission. In the last year, his lawyer, Terry Green of Ottawa, was on a winning track with a strategy that looked like it would win in court. Unfortunately, Bob died before he could see that winning day in court. As well, the court case died with Bob. Bob was a man of principle who believed in fighting for his rights, and he did that right to the end. Those of us who knew Bob are very proud to call him our friend, and we admire him for his values and strong sense of what is right. Bob was one of the founding members of the Niagara Landowners Association, and for the last year was president. Bob and the Niagara Landowners Association helped many local people who were victims of government bullies. People like Dave White and Mike Barnfield, who were fighting frivolous, wrongful charges by the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority for doing routine maintenance on their land, such as filling in a shallow puddle to level the soil. Both men were strong, fought for their rights in court, represented themselves, and with the help of Bob and the Niagara Landowners Association, they won. Jim Williams, an 88-year-old landowner who lived near Beamsville, died on April 19, 2013, of a heart attack brought on by the stress of being harassed and threatened by a Niagara Escarpment Commission enforcement bully named O.J. McDonald. Enforcer O.J. McDonald was aggressive and disrespectful of Mr. Williams, who was a war veteran and a longtime resident of Beamsville. The enforcer marched all around Mr. Williams' private property and told him he couldn't have his old sawmill on his property. It has been there since 1957. He couldn't pile lumber on his property. Lumber is what you get from a sawmill. He couldn't bring in a few loads of soil from his neighbor's place to fill in a few gullies caused by natural erosion, which any responsible landowner would do. And, by the way, his 85-year-old wife, Beth, couldn't sell dresses from a room in her house. She had had a dress shop in town for 30 years. Is that what we mean by law and order? Is that what you would call good government? I think not. When people are afraid of government, when government starts to hurt good people, when government starts to trample upon people's private property rights, then government is wrong and the people need to take back their rights. Thank goodness Bob Mackey and the Niagara Landowners Association were there last year to stand by Jim Williams and support him against the Niagara Escarpment enforcer bully. Ken Lucician of Walker Industries told me the story of his 10-year fight with the Niagara Escarpment Commission. Ken spent 10 years and $10 million to expand Walker's existing quarry. At the end of the process, Walker was forced to go through another hoop a judicial review at Osgoode Hall that was brought on by the Niagara Escarpment Commission. The Niagara Escarpment Commission had been infiltrated by special interest groups that wanted to stop the quarry expansion. It cost another $1 million, and we wonder why infrastructure construction costs so much money. We wonder why housing costs so much money. We wonder why small operators are driven out of business. This is not the way government should be operating. Government should be helping businesses that are trying to build our communities. We need the aggregate. The Bob Mackey Act will repeal the Niagara Escarpment Planning and Development Act. This means that never again will the Niagara Escarpment Commission be able to prohibit a landowner from practicing archery or operating an archery training facility on his private property. This righting of a wrong will be Bob Mackey's legacy. It is a large step forward towards restoring private property rights in Ontario. It is the beginning of a change that is long overdue. It is the beginning of reversing the tide of creeping socialism that has been slowly taking away our property rights for decades. It is the beginning of restoring the strength and good character that is needed to respect the values of our British Christian cultural heritage of freedom, democracy, common law, and private property rights that date back to the Magna Carta of 1215. Our freedom and democracy were hard fought for in wars and parliaments over centuries. Freedom can only be assured in a democracy that is founded on the principle of private property rights, where these rights are secured absolutely by law. Bob Mackey's property rights were denied. We can never let that happen again. Thank you.
Further debate?